did not see this coming. If J.D. Vance and Trump and their campaign had not been terrified of fact-checking, were not enraged by fact-checking, were not enraged by facts, if none of that were true, last night's vice presidential debate would not have been headlined by Vance whining about and yelling about and finally having his mic actually cut because he was angry and yelled at the moderators over fact-checking.
Thank you, Governor. And just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important
we're
because
going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check.
The rules were you guys weren't going to fact check? We actually saw one of the great cliches of American culture spring to life. It was my understanding that there would be no math. Still resonating, often attributed to incumbent President Gerald Ford, even believed to be one of the reasons he lost a debate and an election to Jimmy Carter 48 years ago. Ford, of course, never said that. It was Chevy Chase portraying Ford on Saturday Night Live on September 18, 1976. But when J.D. Vance did that last night, it was my understanding that there would be no fact-checking. That wasn't Chevy Chase. That wasn't Bowen Yang or anybody else portraying Vance. It was Vance himself. And it's how he managed to lose a debate in which Tim Walz came out of the gate so nervous that for a while I was having a little first debate PTSD. Vance also lost this debate because, when asked about whether he would be the final voice in the room approving an Israeli preemptive strike on Iran, the first question of the debate, the most topical question of the debate, he somehow managed to say, "Never mind the Middle East. I'll get to that in a moment. But first, my name is James D. Bowman. No, I'm Jimmy Hamilton. No, I'm J.D. Vance. Well, whoever the hell I am, I'm here to sell you some Amway products."
Would you support or oppose a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran? You have 2 minutes.
So, Margaret, I want to answer the question. First of all, thanks, Governor. Thanks to CBS for hosting the debate. And thanks, most importantly, to the American people who are watching this evening and caring enough about this country to pay attention to this vice presidential debate. I want to answer the question, but I want to actually give an introduction to myself a little bit because I recognize a lot of Americans don't know who either one of us are. I was raised in a working class family. My mother required food assistance for periods of her life. My grandmother...
Virtually everything Tim Walz said was substantial and about policy and about facts. And virtually everything J.D. Vance said and did sounded like an infomercial. Occasionally that worked. But he continually side-eyed the camera and by extension the viewer, and that probably would have been the burn he thought it was going to be if each knowing glance, each time he tried his version of the Sarah Palin wink, it didn't emphasize the fact that he was wearing eyeliner again. And my God, it is polite to address by name the person asking you a question. But Vance did it so often and so phonily that if you had Vance saying, "Well, Norah," or "Yes, Margaret," on your drinking bingo card, you are still unconscious. For the first 10, 15 minutes, the debate was a tie, or maybe Vance was ahead. This was largely because for that span it was entirely not a vice presidential debate. It was a second presidential debate, but by proxy. Don't get me wrong. Walz managed to do it too. He took a dozen bites out of Trump. He pivoted on the Iran question to how many Trump advisors insist Trump should never be let near a crisis like this one again. He threw Vance's anti-Trump quote against him. He said a nearly 80-year-old Donald Trump talking about crowd sizes is not what we need in this moment. He quoted Trump's failure in Iran. He quoted Trump's dismissal of injuries to U.S. servicemen in Iran as headaches, a comment that Trump made just hours earlier. Walz referenced Trump and tweets, referenced how climate change will give you more beachfront property, according to Trump. He scored by noting the bribes Trump took from oil executives at Mar-a-Lago. He scored with Mexico paying for the wall, and especially with Trump sinking the bipartisan border deal. Walz reminded the audience that Vance and Trump had said scientists don't know what they're talking about, economists don't know what they're talking about, authorities don't know what they're talking about, and Vance took the bait and insisted Trump believes in common sense, not experts. The problem is that as smooth as Walz was, what he was trying to defend ultimately was still Trump, and it was putting lipstick on it. It was so much Vance defending Trump, so much Vance attacking Harris, it was exhausting. At one point, as Vance literally referred to our border czar Kamala Harris, he pointed at Tim Walz. I hate to tell you, Senator, that's not Kamala Harris. But the longer that debate went on, and the more topics were addressed, and in greater depth, the more Walz warmed to the process, and I think the more the audience warmed to him. When it stopped being a proxy fight and started being about Vance and Walz, Vance didn't have anybody to talk about anymore. Vance complained about fact-checking. Walz quoted the Bible about what we do for the least among us, and then he offered my pro tip for the day. My pro tip for the day. As well as those things resonated, Walz did miss several opportunities to bury Vance on the subject of Springfield, Ohio, including a moment when Vance insisted millions of illegal immigrants were taking over homes in Springfield, Ohio. Instead, he let Vance skate on that. Just as certainly, Walz danced, and effectively, I might add, around the conflict between where he was and where he has said or implied he was during the Tiananmen Square uprising in China in 1989. Vance could have crushed him then. Instead, for some reason, he changed topics to something he had memorized. What Vance and the Republicans will say was their victory in this debate, and it will resonate because it's not entirely untrue, is that Vance's primary job was to sane wash Trump. For people who are not paying attention or who are only getting the sanitized versions of Trump in the New York Times, Vance seemed perhaps wrong, but definitely reasonable. Frankly, Vance did not seem likely to stab you, only to pick your pocket. Noting that CBS News largely steered out of its ethical skid, and while this was not the best of the debates, it was twice as good as CNN's disaster, there is one last point. To both of their credits, unlike Trump, in every debate he's ever done, they got to issues. They got to guns. They got to January 6th. Vance was wrong about all of these things. But when Vance said the only thing that Trump did wrong was that the Russians bought $500,000 worth of Facebook ads promoting Trump, Walz, picking his jaw off the floor, answered, January 6th was not Facebook ads. And he managed to add of Mike Pence's refusal to overthrow the election on Trump's behalf. That's why Mike Pence isn't on this stage.
I see a candidate out there who refused, and now again, and this, I'm pretty shocked by this, he lost the election. This is not a debate. It's not anything anywhere other than in Donald Trump's world. Because look, when Mike Pence made that decision to certify that election, that's why Mike Pence isn't on this stage. What I'm concerned about is, where is the firewall with Donald Trump?
On the other hand, the governor did fail to take the priceless advice of Democratic strategist Ali Samarco. Quoting, all Tim Walz has to say tonight is, I heard you're here because the last guy got hung up, and it's over, unquote. Lastly, when they addressed gun violence, Vance blamed it exclusively on mental health and soft targets in schools and insisted the answer was better door control. And that was when Tim Walz gave the answer of the night.
This idea of stigmatizing mental health, just because you have a mental health issue doesn't mean you're violent. And I think what we end up doing is we start looking for a scapegoat. Sometimes it just is the guns. It's just the guns.
A couple of debate postscripts, or maybe more accurately, debate prescripts, in a story in which the cumulative IQ of everybody involved is still in less than 3 digits total. Trump went on Kellyanne Conway's Fox show and said, of course Vance would beat Tim Walz last night because, quote, he's going up against a moron, a total moron. How she picked him is unbelievable, unquote. And then, having heard this, Kellyanne Conway went on Jesse Waters' Fox show and said of the debate, quote, I have high expectations about J.D. Waltz. And while I was still trying to figure out if she meant J.D. Vance or Tim Walz or an entirely different other person whose last name is Waltz, like in the last waltz. Kellyanne Conjob came right back and said, quote, the mainstream media and other Democrats did a really stupid thing with J.D. Waltz. They tried to drown him out in the first days after Trump picked him. So there you have it. Your 2024 Republican ticket per Kellyanne Conway. Trump and J.D. Waltz. Unless she meant the actor J.D. Walsh from 2.5 Men, or the late actor J.T. Walsh from Nixon and Good Morning Vietnam, and the bottom line here is it's Kellyanne Conway. She could have meant anything. And sadly, one of the reasons we are in a world in which Kellyanne Conway was not laughed out of Washington in the year 2002 is because the guardrails behind the guardrails beyond the original guardrails also failed. Back to the subject of fact-checking. This was yesterday morning from Brian Stelter, one of the last 2 or 3 media news critics left alive as the industry shrinks like a collapsing star. He and the others are supposed to be calling out cowardice in journalism. Instead, he turned the shrug emoji into written form, and he needed 64 words to do it. Quoting, facts unchecked. CBS News executives are signaling that Norah O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan will not fact-check flagrantly false claims made on stage. Why, that's a filthy, flagrant falsehood. The moderators will give the candidates the opportunity to fact-check each other in real time, CBS Senior Vice President Claudia Milne told the New York Times. Repeating what I wrote last month, moderators are damned if they fact-check and damned if they don't. No, they aren't. No, they aren't. Doing your job as a journalist, describing reality to your readers or viewers or newsletter recipients, telling the truth, calling a lie, up, and down, and then being threatened or abused for doing it, that is not the same as serving as nothing more than the debate timekeeper and the person who says, we'll be right back. And as a result, jeopardizing freedom of the press and democracy itself. That is not damned if you do and damned if you don't. It's just plain old damned. Meanwhile, back at the Looney Ranch, oh, nothing. It's just Trump who is actually responsible by commission and omission for the deaths of more than 1 million Americans because of his literally insane mishandling of COVID. It's just Trump accusing the vice president of murder and misidentifying the victim and conflating the victim and the perpetrator.
I'm outraged that she let in the savage who raped and murdered Rachel Morin. Kamala let her in. She murdered him. In my opinion, Kamala murdered him, just like she did, just like she had a gun in her hand.
Wait, he said him. He said Kamala murdered him, and Kamala Harris let her in. The victim was a woman, you syphilitic menace. Steel yourself for more of this. It is just the beginning. I know you heard this quote yesterday. We should all memorize it. Yale historian Tim Snyder, Trump is in the classic dictatorial position. He needs to die in bed holding all executive power to stay out of prison. This means that he will do whatever he can to gain power, and once in power will do all that he can do to never let it go. This is a basic incentive structure which underlies everything else. It is entirely inconsistent with democracy. Please learn it by the beginning of the new week. Trump continued yesterday to pretend he did something to alleviate post-Helene distress in the South. There were actually stories reading he was first to visit the damage in person, and to note that he launched a GoFundMe that had raised more than $1 million. Left out of each of these stories, though, the reality that he claims to be a multi-billionaire. He rages when contradicted on this point, and he never stops boasting about how much money he has. And instead of going to Georgia or North Carolina or anywhere else and giving away just some of his own money, he launched a GoFundMe to give away other people's money and take credit for it. Oh, and guess what? The GoFundMe? He didn't donate to it either. As to the origin of some of Trump's billions, hundreds of millions, some millions, surprising news from Senate Democrats. They did something about the Egypt bribe scandal. The majority on the Judiciary Committee has now written to the watchdog at the DOJ, the Inspector General, asking him to investigate whether Trump appointees, quote, interfered with and ultimately blocked the criminal probe into the findings of our intelligence agencies that the Egyptian government gave or sought to give Trump $10 million to boost his White House campaign 8 years ago. This is good, boys. But you know, you can also hold hearings. And one more Trump note. A group called the Crooked and Obscene Project has unveiled a giant marionette version of Dementia J. Trump. It will begin its tour of the United States on Apex Harbor Lane in Las Vegas. It is there right now, darkening the sky. They say he's naked, made out of rebar covered with foam, and weighs approximately 6,000 pounds. Wait, that's a marionette? Based on that description, that sounds like him. And because I want you to be able to enjoy my unique, weird, unearthly position on the fringes of this next story as much, frankly, as I am, CNN reports the latest in the RFK Jr. Olivia Nuzzi story is she has sued her former fiancé, Ryan Lizza of Politico. And in the filing, she says that the source of the leaks that got her suspended by New York Magazine for an undisclosed personal relationship with the perviest of the Kennedys was Ryan Lizza of Politico. CNN quotes Livy in the suit filed this week as claiming that Lizza, quote, explicitly threatened to make public personal information about me to destroy my life, career, and reputation, a threat he has since carried out. CNN fleshed this out a bit. You should excuse the expression. Quoting its report, Nuzzi said she believes Lizza began his alleged harassment at the beginning of July as a way to blackmail her back into a relationship with him and punish her when she wouldn't acquiesce. She said by the next month, Lizza had stolen a personal electronic device from her, was hacking her devices, then anonymously shopping information about her to the media. Some of the information may have been doctored to hurt her more, Nuzzi alleged, and she believes Lizza impersonated an anonymous campaign operative to give a political campaign information that would hurt her further, according to the court records. Nuzzi was granted a temporary no-contact order against Lizza. The judge also signed off, CNN reports, on her request to have police accompany her when she attempts to get her possessions back from Lizza. The couple had lived together within the last year, the court filing said. There are going to be cops, did you say? I'm sorry, I have to go now. I have to run to make sure I've got enough popcorn for the rest of this. I will add only this detail to that headline, and the headline would be, Newsy Doozy, court gets up in Liz's bizza over RFK's riz. When Olivia and I lived together in New York and she still worked for the Daily Beast, she frequently traveled to D.C. on stories, and whenever she came back, she'd give me a big hug and say she was sorry for taking me for granted because there was this creepy guy who stalked her every time she went to Washington. Do you know him? She'd ask. His name is Ryan Lizza. Shrug emoji. Also of interest here, well, nothing. Nothing compared to that, obviously. Still, Pete Rose died Monday. People seem to think he's not in the Baseball Hall of Fame because he gambled on baseball while a player and while a manager and while a player-manager. Actually, they were just about to get beyond that, what with all the betting in baseball now. 7 years ago, they were about to let him in when that whole other thing came up. The whole other thing everybody has forgotten about and almost nobody has mentioned since Pete Rose died. The other thing, where he admitted in the court documents that in the 70s when he was married to his first wife, he also had a mistress, and the mistress was 15 years old. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann, my crazy friend.
There's a reason the announcer today is Tony Kornheiser of ESPN, formerly of the Washington Post. Still ahead of us on this edition of Countdown, the death of Pete Rose. That's not the reason. I used to campaign against putting Pete Rose in Baseball's Hall of Fame. Then I campaigned in favor of putting him in Baseball's Hall of Fame. And then in 2017, the little other thing happened. Like I said, that's when I started campaigning again for never putting him in Baseball's Hall of Fame. You may recall in 1989, he'd been banned from baseball, and in 2017, Pete Rose sued the investigator whose work led up to that banishment, and in discovery, up popped this sworn deposition from a woman who, to quote The Hollywood Reporter, alleges that Rose had a relationship with her for several years beginning before she turned 16. Rose acknowledged in court documents that he had sex with the woman, but thought she was 16 at the time. When you admit to sex with a child, and your defense was, I thought she was 16, you're done. That's why he's not in the Hall of Fame and will never be in the Hall of Fame. All this in depth in Things I Promise Not to Tell, coming up. First, there are still more new idiots to talk about, a rollicking edition of the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. And this is why Tony Kornheiser, formerly of the Washington Post, is the announcer today. The Bronze, worse, the WNBA Players Association, Terry Carmichael Jackson, president. One player poked another player in the eye during a game. A reporter from USA Today asked the poker politely and specifically if it was deliberate or an accident. The player, to her credit, did not get angry, did not go all snark, but said hurting another player would never be part of her game. She was just reaching for the ball. The player and the reporter were both pros about it. There were no angry words. There were no complaints. But the injured player who got the finger in the eye was the rookie who put the WNBA on the map this year, Caitlin Clark. And the reporter was Christine Brennan, a fierce advocate for women's sports, such a veteran that when she joined the Washington Post alongside Tony Kornheiser, she had to respond to not just accusations, but assumptions that she had gotten the job because she was sleeping with a Washington TV sportscaster. And for reasons yet to be explained, the WNBA Players Association decided to respond to the extreme professionalism of Chris Brennan, and the player, who was such a pro, I'm leaving her name out of this, responded to this by slandering Christine Brennan, quoting a message on behalf of the 144, that would be the players in the union. To unprofessional members of the media like Christine Brennan, you are not fooling anyone. That so-called interview in the name of journalism was a blatant attempt to bait a professional athlete into participating in a narrative that is false and designed to fuel racist, homophobic, and misogynistic vitriol on social media. You cannot hide behind your tenure. Instead of demonstrating the cornerstones of journalism ethics like integrity, objectivity, and a fundamental commitment to truth, you have chosen to be indecent and downright insincere. You have abused your privileges and do not deserve the credentials issued to you. This is the statement of the Players Union, and you certainly are not entitled to any interviews with the members of this union or any other athlete in sport. Those credentials mean that you can ask anything, but they also mean that you know the difference between what you should and should not. We see you. Our relationship with the media is a delicate one, and we will continue to strengthen because the media is essential in growing the game. No one knows that better than we do, but the players are entitled to better. They are entitled to professionalism. We call on USA Today Network to review its principles of ethical conduct for newsrooms and address what we believe is a violation of several core principles, including seeking and reporting the truth. USA Today Sports should explain why a reporter with clear bias and ulterior motives was assigned to cover the league. We also urge the league to review its policies and take measures to prevent such issues, protecting the integrity of the game and its players. Terry Carmichael Jackson, Executive Director, WNBPA. Yes, congratulations. We may have reached actual equality in sports, where the women athletes and their organizations can be as big a set of jerks and idiots and morons as male athletes. Perhaps we've even gone past equality to women being in the lead in these areas, because they just trashed a woman who a mere 30 years ago was being thrown out of sports locker rooms because she was a woman who is one of the people without whom the only professional opportunities for American women basketball stars in this country, the only opportunities would not be in this country. They would be in Russia still, or Europe, or the Canary Islands. The WNBA and its Players Association must immediately apologize to Christine Brennan, and WNBPA President Terry Carmichael Jackson must resign or be fired. She just made an asshole out of herself and every one of her players. She's just set back her sport and the gains it has made in the last few years. If this is how the WNBPA is going to treat its most loyal, most honored reporters, frankly, all news organizations should boycott the WNBA, not even report the goddamn scores, and networks like ESPN that carry WNBA games should refuse to do so until the apology is made. The WNBA is, by doing a press release like this, fabricating an environment unsafe for media with exactly the same kind of deliberate targeting of reporters done by the likes of Donald effing Trump. And sports history tells us that when a players' union attacks the media, its next target will be the fans it doesn't like. In other words, you and I are next. Chris Brennan might be on the Mount Rushmore of the builders of women's sports in this country. Terry Carmichael Jackson, Executive Director of the WNBPA, is a bully and a lawyer. The runner-up, Leon, as Trump has called him. I'd love to know what's wrong with Elon Musk. Based on those profiles, my guess is he's stoned. Look, he's a fascist, he's a nut job, he's unstable, and as somebody noted, all the spy movies of the 60s revolve around a crazy billionaire who has the rockets and all the communication systems and decides to take over the world. No, I expect you to die, Mr. Bond. Elmo's latest problem is, though, as he tries to take over the world, he's making an extraordinary number of really stupid mistakes. He has now posted one of these right-winger, I'm recording this in my car, idiot videos. And he wrote with it, as this video describes, Trump supports women's rights far more than Kamala. The video shows a young woman with dead eyes and badly dyed hair who rambles on about how Kamala Harris has already been president. Is that true? Did I miss something? Am I coming out of a coma? Was she president already? She wasn't. Okay. And that Trump, quote, was already president. How many rights did you lose? I don't mean to tell you your business, ladies, not after that opening part of this segment, but a lot of them, actually, a lot of rights have already been lost. The narrator is clearly unaware of the repeal of Roe v. Wade or the Trump plan to institute abortion bans wherever he can and punish the states where he can't. Leon put this out without really listening to it, didn't he? Because Ozempic side effects? But the worst, our winner, Rob Schneider. Idiot. Formerly on Saturday Night Live, and apparently he was funny during the audition. The basketball great Dikembe Mutombo has died after a long and terrible fight against brain cancer. And Rob Schneider, who has gone over there to the fascist Nick at Night world where they'll all pretend your career isn't over, provided you support Trump, decided he had to say something about it. Schneider posted a video of the late beloved hoop star, Mr. Mutombo, doing a video from Christmas of 2021 urging people to get the COVID shot so they could all get together. And he wrote above it, "Rest in peace. I'm sure this is just another coincidence, but I took a pass on the jab, and I'm not going to let anyone I know and who will listen get it either." Well, there's this much to say about Rob Schneider. The one advantage he has is he never has to face the prospect of what Dikembe Mutombo had to face in brain cancer. Rob, as they say, no pain, no gain, but no brain, no pain. Schneider, today's worst person in the world! To the number one story on the countdown, and as promised yesterday, some thoughts on the passing of Pete Rose. And I wanted to take extra time to think about it because my thoughts about Pete Rose are all over the map. And through the history of my life, they are even further all over the map. For 20 years, I campaigned against Pete Rose being in baseball's Hall of Fame. And just after I had an epiphany that said, no, I think he should be in. Just after that came the scandal that proved that he had had an ongoing sexual relationship with an underage girl. And the Hall of Fame question became academic. I will say that this issue of Pete Rose and gambling, and Pete Rose and the all-time hit record in baseball, the man who made more base hits than anybody else, the man who ran out every ground ball and every fly ball and every walk. The Pete Rose story really is summarized by the first thought I had when the news was announced Monday evening that he had died sometime during the day Monday. My thought was, what, did he have a bet down on that Mets-Braves game and it killed him? I knew Pete Rose enough to know that he would have appreciated that joke. He would not have appreciated the fact that he had died without being put into the Baseball Hall of Fame because he said many times that he thought they were waiting for him to die before they would put him in. I don't know if he ever will go in. That issue of the underage, well, what it was, child rape, will never go away. But that's why he's not in the Hall of Fame. I believe everything was turning for Pete Rose, 2010 to 2015. He had gotten back into baseball. He was a commentator on Fox Sports, and particularly given the nature of Fox Sports and the nature of the decline in baseball commentary, especially on the national level, he was doing very well. And then came the story in 2017, and he had not been heard from since. It's ironic that baseball and gambling are now in bed together so frequently, so visibly, so positively that what Pete Rose did while he managed and before that played for the Cincinnati Reds is seen almost as a series of misdemeanors. It's a little bit more than that. Pete Rose, and let me explain this as briefly and not intricately as possible. Pete Rose gambled on some Cincinnati Reds baseball games while he was the manager of the team and, in fact, player and manager of the team. But he did not gamble on other Cincinnati Reds games. He was the first one to point out, even after all of the dirt about the gambling came out, that he never bet against his own team. That's the cardinal sin in sports. If you bet against your own team, why, then you may have gone out there and tried to lose, in which case you are done. That's the whole premise of the 1919 World Series and the 8 great players led by shoeless Joe Jackson, who were never permitted to play again once their confessions and their trial ended the year after the 1919 World Series did. That's not what Pete Rose was accused of, but in a way, he did the passive-aggressive version of that, because if you are the manager of a baseball team and you are placing bets in thousands of dollars in amounts on some of the games, what about the games you chose not to bet on? Did you manage them differently? And after all, it is the manager who decides which pitcher is starting the game, which pitcher is coming in the sixth inning. The game is 5-2. Your team is losing. Are you using your best relief pitcher in the seventh inning because you have a bet on the game? Or are you saving him till tomorrow when you will have a bet on the game? That was the crux for me of why I could never support Pete Rose going into baseball's Hall of Fame. As much as my experience with him personally was similar to what most people's was. He was very charming. He was very likable, and certainly you could talk about the nuances, subtleties, and history of the game with Pete Rose as you could with few other players. He didn't just know everybody from his own era. He knew everybody who'd ever played Major League Baseball, at least seemingly. He knew the details of the life of Ty Cobb, the man who he supplanted as the all-time leader in hits. He knew about 19th century players. He knew about the original Cincinnati Reds Stockings of 1869. And he was always fascinating. And particularly if you were willing to pay him, he was always good for an anecdote, an autograph, a piece of memorabilia, which I'll circle back to in a moment, because when I was a teenager, I knew something was wrong with Pete Rose because of that issue of memorabilia. The other reason my mind changed on whether or not Rose should go to the Hall of Fame was, of course, the advent of the PED scandal, the performance-enhancing drugs. First steroids, and then the next wave of human growth hormone, and then what I presume has been going on behind the surface in baseball for a while, whatever came next. Unfortunately, I'm one of those fans who, after 2 long, painful, no, these guys are clean scandals, has serious doubts that all these guys are clean. How can we ever be sure again? But that's another subject. My experience with Pete Rose was largely limited to the year 1989. I can see in my mind's eye the cover of the Sports Illustrated magazine in which the Rose scandal, which I had been hearing about behind the scenes for more than a decade, broke. I'm standing outside the Angels spring training facility in Palm Springs, California, doing a live shot for my television station in Los Angeles from the parking lot of the library across the street, and there's the Sports Illustrated with his picture on it. The entirety of that year, from March of 1989 through August 24th, 1989, was what's the latest in the Pete Rose scandal. Finally, in August, it seemed to have stalled, although there was clear evidence that they were trying to get rid of Pete Rose and that he might be suspended or banished or fired as manager of the Cincinnati Reds, or something else would happen, or he would be indicted for tax evasion, or 1,000 rumors swirled. Finally, I had a couple of weeks of vacation coming to me, and I went back to New York. I was to leave for Los Angeles and return to my job, I believe, on a Friday morning. Thursday afternoon, the story broke that Pete Rose was going to be suspended or banished by the Commissioner of Baseball, Bart Giamatti, actor Paul Giamatti's father, the next day. Well, my flight was leaving the next day, so I postponed that. And I went to that news conference, and I have never seen anything quite like the performance of Commissioner Giamatti, who was a baseball purist and believed in justice and believed in fair play and believed more than those things. He believed in baseball, and he was justice in baseball. And he managed to end Pete Rose's baseball career, whether Pete Rose knew that's what he was signing in the document that he signed or not. And I was in the crowd by sheer happenstance, sharing a crew with a reporter from Channel 2 in New York, using Channel 2 in New York's equipment for my report for Channel 2 in Los Angeles. And I remember thinking, as I watched Bart Giamatti in front of us, taking no questions but making a speech. And he was the former president of Yale. He could make a hell of a speech, and you know what his son can do. Bart Giamatti standing there, and I remember saying to the cameraman from the New York station, I have never heard or seen anybody more alive than the Commissioner of Baseball at this moment. He died 1 week later while on vacation. A chain smoker, and he collapsed of a heart attack 1 week later. One Friday, Pete Rose is being banned, and the end of that saga, as Giamatti said that day, the story of Mr. Rose is now over. And a week later, Giamatti's life was over. Extraordinary juxtaposition. Very, very sobering thing for a 30-year-old sportscaster to contemplate. In any event, my next face-to-face experience with Pete Rose came in Cooperstown in the year 2009. I was up there with the broadcaster Tony Kubek, who was going into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and his family. I had been their favorite newscaster and a favorite sportscaster, and Tony Kubek had been a favorite sportscaster of mine when he did the baseball game of the week. And somehow, Tony Kubek's son invited me to be an honorary member of the family for the Hall of Fame week, and I went up there and luxuriated in this little town in upstate New York full of Victorian houses and what smelled like snow already coming, and it was July. Had a great time, had a blast, and there was Pete Rose. So I talked to him, and Pete Rose told me off the record that he had had a preliminary meeting with the commissioner of baseball about what he had to do to be reinstated, and that he'd come back as a special instructor. There'd be all sorts of limits as to what he could and couldn't do, but that once they had tried this out 10 years before he had been banned, but he had been named to the baseball all-century team for the 20th century. And even though he could not work in baseball and any players who associated with him were subject to being fined or punished or warned, baseball was somehow able to bring him onto the field at the World Series and at the All-Star game and present him as a member of the all-century team. This was a little discordant, a little hypocritical, and yet it was the first step in the rehabilitation of Pete Rose. Somewhere after the PED scandals broke, and I said, well, you know what? This is comparatively nothing, what Rose did, compared to what these guys did. And then baseball began to accept the idea of gambling, to perform its own gambling-adjacent services like Fantasy League Baseball, run by baseball, providing the stats, and edge ever closer to having an official wagering sponsor of each team, which it does now. As that moment came, it became clear that Pete Rose was going to get back into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And not because he had improved at all, not because he had admitted that he had gambled on baseball, because he did that rather quickly, because he could sign baseballs for money. As long as he wrote, "I'm sorry, I bet on baseball," he could get an extra $20. There's the old joke about the rarest of Pete Rose items is the Pete Rose unautographed baseball. In any event, I believe in 2014, Bob Lee and I did a special about Pete Rose and his reinstatement and whether or not it should happen. And it included an interview with Pete Rose, and he was exceptional and frank, and you could not listen to that and say, no, there's no way I can let him back in. I had already come out after years of arguing this, arguing against my old partner, Dan Patrick, who insisted Rose should be in the Hall of Fame, arguing like we argued about nothing else. I now suddenly jump to the pro Pete Rose side, and in a couple of years after that, I'm doing an ESPN special about the reinstatement of Pete Rose, and I say to him, I'm convinced. I don't think what you did was right. I think it does not require an eternal ban. I think they should put you back in, but no, you can't manage again. And then came the story about the girl. I don't know that he'll ever go in, but do not, as this subject comes back to the forefront in the wake of his sudden passing on Monday afternoon, do not think that he has been shunted aside because of the gambling. He was shunted aside because of the gambling. That was coming to an end. He had been welcomed back, at least to the degree that baseball, which could have very easily said to Fox, no, you can't put him on the baseball broadcasts. You can't put him on the studio shows. You can't have him from center field during your World Series telecast before and after the games themselves. You can't do that. They could have easily said that. They never did until that last scandal broke. And I don't know if he ever recovers from that. And, of course, it is tragic. It is somehow a tragic story the way a Shakespearean play is a tragic story. Because the contrasts between the good Pete Rose and the bad Pete Rose looks so stark until you realize that it's the same guy, and these are two aspects of the same guy, this competitiveness that led him with good but not exceptional talents to amass more hits than anybody else in baseball history, that led him to will a couple of teams into the postseason, that allowed him to change from starting as a second baseman, then becoming an outfielder, then becoming a third baseman, then becoming a first baseman, each time to improve the team that he was playing on. That will was the same will that said, I'm going to be the greatest gambler of all time. The old joke was, Mickey Mantle told this story, that his nickname, Charlie Hustle, which he embraced, was from an incident in a spring training game where Mantle and Whitey Ford, his Yankee teammate, were seated on the bench during a Cincinnati Reds New York Yankees spring training game in March of perhaps 1963. And somebody hit a titanic home run far into the right field stands. I mean, a 500-foot home run that would have cleared the fence 50 or 60 feet above the top of the outfield fence. And they, in their minds, Mantle recalled Rose leaping above the fence and coming only, 43 feet short of catching the home run. The problem is Pete Rose was a second baseman then. He did not play the outfield in spring training or anywhere else until 1966 or 67, and the Charlie Hustle nickname we know predates that. But the Charlie Hustle image is that exactly. False hustle. As the Saturday Night Live character played by Garrett Morris pointed out, Charlie Hustle, you bet. An ironic thing because that happened before we knew about the gambling. So the Mantle story of where he got that nickname from is probably conflated with an actual event in a World Series game, which a St. Louis Cardinals outfielder named Mike Shannon tried to catch Mantle's home run that won Game 3, I believe it was, of the 1964 World Series, landed in the upper deck. And if you look carefully on the film, Mike Shannon, perhaps 200 feet below where the home run landed, is leaping in hopes of catching the ball, which he could not have caught even if he had been 190 feet tall. I believe Mantle conflated Shannon and Pete Rose. So the Charlie Hustle thing was more likely a Cincinnati Reds New York Yankees exhibition game in which Pete Rose must have gotten a walk as a rookie, as an unknown rookie who had played the year before in the lowest minor league rungs. And he ran to first base, and Whitey Ford turned to Mickey Mantle and said, get a load of Charlie Hustle. And Rose took that and made money off of it. Pete Rose was not a contradiction. He was one guy. He was going to beat you. Unfortunately, like so many people for whom that is a mantra, there are no rules. Ultimately, they may stop themselves from doing illegal things for fear of getting caught, or they may not stop themselves from doing illegal things for fear of getting caught. Pete Rose got caught. As a last note, I promised you that I had found out about the Pete Rose scandals without knowing what they could have been about. I knew there was something wrong. In my late teens, I was one of the first of the baseball card collectors as a kid. And so I was at all the primordial baseball card conventions, we called them in those days, and the traffic was almost all in cards and to some degree autographs and photos, but generally publicly accessible stuff. Magazines, scorecards, yearbooks, the stuff anybody could buy, just these were the ones that people hadn't thrown out. Except there was a small market in game-worn baseball uniforms. They were prized beyond words. I don't know that there were more than 100 of them in private hands in 1976. And then suddenly, everywhere you turned at the card conventions of 1977, there was a Pete Rose jersey available. Every dealer in the New York show in the spring of 1977 seemed to have an autographed, game-worn, authentic Pete Rose game-used uniform. It made no sense. And from throughout his career, dating back to his rookie year, which was at that point 14 years earlier, it made no sense. Well, of course, what was happening was Pete Rose was in financial trouble, and we figured that out pretty quickly, that the only possible source for these uniforms was Pete Rose. in the past, baseball uniforms had leaked out through charity events, through teams selling extra uniforms, from equipment managers stealing them and then selling them into the hobby. But Pete Rose's were so voluminous that they could have only come from one source. Pete Rose, he did it for the money. He would take his uniform off and take it home and wear a different one the next day. There were hundreds upon hundreds of game-worn Pete Rose uniforms. There may have been some point in the late 70s where there were more Pete Rose game-worn uniforms than all the game-worn uniforms of all the other players in baseball history combined. So we knew in the hobby, Pete needs the money. The joke was this, and it is the joke that I think also, in addition to the one I already made, Pete Rose might have enjoyed. I don't remember if I told him about it or not. The joke was that the collector goes up to the dealer in uniforms sometime in the late 70s or early 80s and says, I'd like to buy a Pete Rose game-worn uniform. And the dealer says, great. Cincinnati, Philadelphia, or Montreal. And the collector is a little surprised that he has these options. Cincinnati, flannel, or double knit? Flannel, full sleeve pinstripe, or 1963 to 66 vest style? The full sleeve pinstripe, please. Okay. Home or away? And the guy is now totally flummoxed and says, home. And the dealer says, one other question for you. Yes? What size would you like? I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. We're now back to 5 episodes a week, posting nightly just after midnight Eastern. Once again, there is a Monday countdown. Please send this podcast to somebody who does not yet know that they need to be listening to it. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of the music. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums. The music was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my friend Tony Kornheiser. Everything else, as always, was pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for today. 4 weeks and 6 days until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,366th day since convicted felon drooling J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the election, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if we have to keep him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news requires. Until then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check.